Deep inside a single Philippine grave lay more gold than an entire European kingdom's treasury. Yet for centuries, the world branded their makers primitive. So what terrifying truth did history try to bury? One burial site in the Philippines contained 1,247 finished gold artifacts, not raw ore pulled from a riverbed, not rough nuggets, finished rings, ritual vessels, thread components, and trade weights calibrated to Chinese imperial measurement standards. The most celebrated medieval gold hoard in Western European history, the kind that took an entire kingdom's treasury to produce, contains fewer refined objects than this single grave. And the reason you've never heard that number before is the same reason the objects that didn't make it underground were melted into Spanish coins before anyone could study them. That's not a rounding error. That's not a contested footnote. That's one burial site, one person's grave goods, more technical gold work than a European monarchy's lifetime accumulation. And it was sitting in Philippine soil for centuries while textbooks described the people who made it as isolated, primitive, and stateless. Let's be honest about what the accepted version of this history actually says, because the story isn't entirely blank, and pretending otherwise doesn't help. Mainstream Southeast Asian history has documented trade connections between the Philippine archipelago and its neighbors for decades. Scholars acknowledge that Indian and Chinese influence moved through maritime routes across the region. The general outline of a connected Southeast Asia is not a secret in academic circles. It shows up in peer-reviewed journals, in museum catalogues, in university courses dedicated to the region. The problem is not that the trade is unacknowledged. The problem is where the Philippine societies are placed within it. The accepted version consistently positions them at the receiving end. They got Chinese ceramics. They got silk. They were a destination for goods produced elsewhere, a stop on routes planned by others. The producing end, the sophisticated, organized, technically skilled end. That part of the story got assigned to everyone except the people living in the archipelago. That framing sounds almost reasonable until you ask what the burial site is actually made of. Then it stops working entirely. Those 1,247 objects were analyzed by the National Museum of the Philippines in collaboration with international institutions. The findings were peer-reviewed and published. And what the study found is this: the alloy compositions in those artifacts are not the result of simple hammering. They require multi-stage smelting. Multiple rounds of heating, refining, combining metals in precise ratios to achieve specific properties. That process does not happen by accident in a village with no specialized knowledge and no infrastructure. It happens in a workshop. It happens when people have dedicated time, dedicated tools, and dedicated expertise passed down across generations. This was not a lucky gold deposit. This was an industry. The objects themselves confirm it. Some of the pieces use filigree, extremely fine wire twisted and soldered into decorative patterns. Others use granulation, tiny spheres of gold fused to a surface to create texture. These are the exact techniques that European goldsmiths of the same era considered markers of advanced civilization when they found them in Mediterranean artifacts. When Filipino craftspeople used them, the colonial record called the producers tribal. The question that the metallurgical study raises is not whether these people could make gold. It's obvious they could. The question is, who were they making it for? The answer is in Chinese state archives. Song dynasty trade documents from the 10th through the 13th centuries, 400 to 600 years before any Spanish ship reached the Philippines, explicitly name Philippine archipelago polities as gold exporting partners, not as recipients of trade, as exporters. Organized, recurring, state-level trade. The documents list the goods exchanged. Philippine gold and beeswax going out, Chinese ceramics and silk coming in. These are not vague references to a distant island. These are named ports, named goods, named exchange relationships that show up repeatedly across multiple decades of imperial record-keeping. Chinese imperial bureaucracy did not document casual encounters. It documented formal economic relationships. The fact that Philippine polities appear in those records means they were recognized as entities capable of sustained, organized trade, not as tribes encountered by merchants who felt like writing something down. As partners in a system that China considered worth maintaining, this shifts the scale of what we're looking at. The burial site is not an anomaly. It is a data point in a network that connected the Philippine archipelago to one of the largest economies in the medieval world. The gold in that grave was not extraordinary because one particularly talented craftsperson happened to exist. It was extraordinary because it was produced by a society embedded in a pan-Asian trade system, with access to markets, to demand signals, to the kind of long-term economic relationship that encourages specialization and technical refinement over time. So if China was buying Philippine gold for centuries, and the records prove it was, what happened to the Philippine side of that ledger? The ports, the political structures, the records of who organized the trade, who held the relationships, who decided what to smelt and what to ship. Where is the Philippine paper trail? This is where the story turns. The Philippine side of the trade record did exist. It existed in the form of the objects themselves, in court regalia worn by rulers who had the political authority to conduct state-level trade, in ritual objects used in ceremonies that marked the social order of complex polities, in burial goods placed in graves because the community believed the person being buried deserved to enter whatever came next, surrounded by the finest things their civilization could produce. The burial site is the archive. The gold is the document. And here is what was done to it. Spanish colonial administrators arrived in the archipelago in 1565. Ecclesiastical and administrative records from the colonial period. Documents that exist, that have been read, that are citable. Record what happened to the gold they found. They melted it, systematically. The physical archive was converted into currency and shipped to Spain. Rings, vessels, regalia, ritual objects, the material culture of centuries of sophisticated production, liquidated into coin. This is not speculation or inference. The colonial records document the confiscation and melting explicitly. The administrators knew they were taking gold. They did not preserve it for study. They processed it. But the physical destruction was only the first stage. Once the objects were gone, colonial ethnographers and administrators faced the question of how to describe the societies they were governing. And here is the second stage. They used the absence of the objects they had just destroyed as evidence. The people who had produced this gold were reclassified. The political vocabulary that would have described their polities as states, with trade relationships, with specialized production, with court structures, was replaced. They became tribes. They became pagan villages without political organization. They became pre-contact societies with no history worth preserving. The erasure created the evidence for its own justification. They destroyed the proof, then used the absence of proof as the argument. The colonial record says, these people had no sophisticated material culture. How do we know? Because we found no sophisticated material culture. The objects that would have contradicted that claim had been melted before the ethnographers arrived to look. The framework that would have made their sophistication recognizable was dismantled at the same time. This is not passive forgetting. It has a structure. Physical destruction first, then conceptual reclassification. The vocabulary itself was weaponized. Words like tribe, pagan, pre-literate. These are not neutral descriptive terms. In the colonial framework, they carried an entire theory of social development that placed the people they described outside history, outside civilization, outside the category of societies that produce things worth studying or preserving. And some of that vocabulary persists, not always in academic work, where the conversation has moved, but in textbooks, in the kind of general historical framing that shapes what most people believe before they ever read a journal article. The double erasure left a shape in the common understanding of Philippine history that has been slow to fill back in. So the question becomes a practical one. Is any of this recoverable? If the objects were melted, the records rewritten, the framework dismantled, what can actually be known? More than the erasure intended. Because the objects that were underground when the Spanish arrived were not confiscated. They could not be. They were invisible. And those objects, including the 1,247 artifacts from the burial site, survived intact into a period when they could be studied with tools that their makers could not have imagined. Modern archaeometallurgy can read a gold object the way a forensic lab reads a crime scene. Trace element analysis, the precise measurement of tiny concentrations of other metals mixed into the gold, creates a chemical fingerprint. That fingerprint can be matched to specific ore sources. Different island regions in the Philippine archipelago produced gold with different trace element profiles. By matching the artifact's fingerprints to those profiles, researchers can identify which island each object's gold came from, even without a single written record of the trade. The National Museum study found exactly this: trace element signatures in the burial site's artifacts that are consistent with gold sourced from multiple Philippine island regions, not one mine. Multiple sources. The gold in that single burial had traveled through an inter-island trade network before it was ever crafted into its final form. The network that was supposed to have never existed can now be mapped from the surviving chemistry of the gold itself. This research is ongoing. New artifacts are being analyzed. New findings are being published. The map of pre-colonial Philippine trade that colonial erasure tried to make impossible to reconstruct is being rebuilt object by object, fingerprint by fingerprint. The history is not closed. It is being recovered in real time, in peer-reviewed journals, with methods that produce results any other researcher can verify and challenge. 3 facts you can cite today, right now, to anyone who asks. First, a single Philippine burial site yielded 1,247 finished gold artifacts requiring multi-stage smelting, confirmed by peer-reviewed metallurgical analysis from the National Museum of the Philippines. Second, Song Dynasty imperial records from the 10th through 13th centuries document Philippine polities as organized gold exporting trade partners, 4 centuries before European contact. Third, Spanish colonial administrative records explicitly document the systematic confiscation and melting of Philippine gold objects after 1565, followed by the deliberate reclassification of the producing societies as primitive tribes. These are not claims. They are documented facts with named sources. The 1,247 objects in that burial were not placed there as a historical argument. Nobody was thinking about colonial erasure or textbook narratives. Those objects were placed in a grave as an act of love. Someone died, and the people who loved them believed they deserved to move into whatever came next, surrounded by the most beautiful, most technically accomplished things their civilization knew how to make. The sophistication in those objects was not performed for an outside audience. It was not produced to impress a foreign power or earn recognition from a civilization that considered itself superior. It existed because it existed, because the people who made it were good at making it, and making it mattered to them, and they had built the knowledge, the infrastructure, and the trade relationships to make it extraordinarily well. Colonial erasure tried to make that disappear. It succeeded above ground. It failed below it. Your ancestors didn't need to be discovered. They were already connected to the world, to China's imperial markets, to inter-island networks that moved gold and beeswax and ceramics across hundreds of miles of open water, to a system of production and exchange that left its trace in Chinese state archives and in the chemistry of surviving gold. The truth of that did not require European permission to be real. It just required the ground to keep it safe long enough for someone to dig. What other pre-colonial Philippine sites do you think deserve this level of analysis? And why haven't they gotten it yet? The archaeometallurgy being done right now is producing a map that gets more detailed with every artifact studied. That map is not finished. And every site still unexcavated, every object still unstudied in museum storage, is another part of it waiting to be read. This gold was their proof of existence. It survived. Now, so does the truth. The research that produced these findings is not hidden. It is not locked behind institutional access or buried in specialist journals that require credentials to read. The National Museum of the Philippines has published its metallurgical findings. The Song Dynasty trade records have been translated, verified, and cited in peer-reviewed Southeast Asian history journals. The archaeometallurgy work is ongoing, and its interim results are publicly available. The gap is not in the evidence. The gap is in what gets taught. A student in Manila going through a standard secondary school curriculum today will spend more time on the Spanish colonial period than on the 10 centuries of organized trade, gold production, and political complexity that preceded it. Not because the pre-colonial history is undocumented, because the curriculum inherited its structure from a period when documenting that history was not the goal. That is not a conspiracy. It does not require anyone to be actively hiding anything right now. It just requires institutional inertia to keep doing what institutions do. Reproduce what was already there, but the material to change it exists. That is the point. 3 facts you can cite right now, to anyone who asks. 1. A single burial site in the Philippine archipelago yielded 1,247 finished gold artifacts, jewelry, ritual vessels, and trade weights, dated to the pre-colonial period, centuries before Spanish contact in 1565. The volume and technical quality of these objects exceeds contemporaneous finds from any other site in mainland Southeast Asia. 2. Chinese imperial trade records from the 10th through 13th centuries CE explicitly name Philippine polities as gold exporting partners in state-level, recurring exchange. These records predate Spanish arrival by 400 to 600 years and describe a trade system, not occasional contact. 3. Metallurgical analysis conducted by the National Museum of the Philippines confirmed that the alloy compositions of the burial site artifacts require multi-stage smelting, not simple hammering of raw ore. Trace element signatures in the gold indicate raw materials sourced from multiple Philippine island regions, proving inter-island supply networks fed into centralized production. These 3 facts alone dismantle the framework of isolation and primitiveness that colonial administrators installed and that some textbooks have not yet removed. The reason to care about this is not nostalgia. It is not a political argument about which civilization was better or more deserving. It is simpler than that. When you erase the evidence that a society was sophisticated, you do not just damage that society's historical reputation. You damage the cognitive tools available to everyone who comes after. You remove data points that could have informed how we understand trade networks, how we understand the development of metallurgical knowledge, how we understand the relationship between material culture and political organization across the pre-colonial Pacific and Southeast Asian world. The erasure was a loss for historical knowledge generally, not just for the Philippines, and recovery is possible. That is the part that changes the shape of this story. Every artifact that survived underground is a data point. Every trace element signature is a coordinate on a map that is being rebuilt from the objects themselves without needing the written records that were destroyed. The inter-island networks, the production centers, the trade routes, these can be reconstructed from chemistry. The archive that was melted into coin can be partially reassembled from what the ground kept safe. That work is happening now. It will keep happening. The 1,247 objects from that burial were placed underground as love and came back up as evidence. They survived a colonial policy specifically designed to eliminate them by chance of geography. They were below the surface when the surface was being cleared. There are more sites. There are more objects in storage that have not been analyzed with modern archaeometallurgy. There are more trace element signatures waiting to place more coordinates on that map. The history is not closed. It is being written right now, from the surviving gold outward, and the picture it is producing is of a world that was already complex, already connected, and already accomplished, long before anyone from outside arrived to write it down.